Honestly, what do you think that experience did to you as a child?
Well, like all extraordinary experiences, particularly during wartime, it had its harrowing side, but it also had I think it had in many ways, a very beneficial effect on my makeup. Some people might say that's a stupid thing to say, you could have been killed, and that's true. But given that I was there, given that I was present during the Japanese fighting around Shanghai from 1937 onwards, and then interned by them during the war, on the one hand, it gave me a very realistic view of the world. I never had any patience with the view that the Americans were wrong to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I had no sympathy with the CND movements, after the war, those marches from Aldermaston struck me like a sort of glorified children's crusade.
Why?
Well, they were ignoring the reality of the world that we lived in. The nuclear weapons have kept the peace between the superpowers, and our own comparatively small nuclear strike force would have been a last desperate, counterattack if we were ever threatened with attack by the Soviet Union.
Do you think that applies in Hiroshima and Nagasaki as well?
Absolutely. Tragically, a couple of 100,000 Japanese died in those two cities, but those deaths were nothing by comparison with the number that would have died had the Americans and British been obliged to fight their way up through Singapore and Hong Kong and Saigon and Shanghai. The one major city the Americans had to fight for during the Second World War was Manila in the Philippines. During about 2 months of ferocious fighting, I think something like 20,000 Japanese soldiers died, but over 100,000 Filipino civilians were just butchered by Japanese troops running amok. More than died on the first day at Hiroshima. During the American landings on Okinawa, which is very close to the Japanese home islands, something like 200,000 Japanese civilians died. I think the atomic bomb saved lives. And also, of course, they have a sort of apocalyptic significance that touches a sort of mythic level of our imaginations. This is, primitive man inventing fire.
Have you always been obsessed with technology?
I'm not sure if I have been obsessed by technology. I've been very interested in it, and it's touched my imagination in a way that isn't really the done thing in England. The Scots have always been great engineers. But the English have always looked down, really, on engineering and technology to their cost. And I was brought up in Shanghai, which was an American zone of influence, and I think I've always had an American view of technology. I regard it as optimistic, a good thing, makes life more interesting, allows you to get on with more, other things. I've never turned my back against it, as I think so many English do, even to this day. We live in a world that has been almost entirely remade by science and technology. This covers almost every part of our lives, from the most basic, from motorways and the motor car to high-tech hospitals and airports, to the sort of invisible technologies of data processing, microwave links that are transmitting our bank balances and TV programs. We're surrounded by advanced and more invisible technologies, and one can't ignore them. One's got to respond imaginatively to them if one's a writer or painter. And I've always tried to do that. Now, I began as a science fiction writer, but in many ways, my interest in science and technology has nothing to do with science fiction at all. If what we think of as genre science fiction, the American SF of the post-war period, a lot of it written by British writers, if you try to imagine genre SF never existing, I would still have been just as interested in science and technology, and I think my fiction would have contained a lot of elements of it.
From the Atrocity Exhibition by J.G. Ballard. Captain Webster studied the prints. They showed 1. A thick-set man in an Air Force jacket, unshaven face half hidden by the dented hat peak. 2. A transverse section through the spinal level T12. 3. A crayon self-portrait by David Feary, 7-year-old schizophrenic at the Belmont Asylum, Sutton. 4. Radio spectra from the quasar DTA-102. 5. An anterior-posterior radiograph of a skull, estimated capacity 1500 cc. 6. Spectroheliogram of the sun taken with the K line of calcium. 7. Left and right handprints showing massive scarring between second and third metacarpal bones. To Dr. Nathan he said, "And all these make up one picture."
I mean, the other book which a mass audience is about to know you for, given that David Cronenberg is putting together a film about it at the moment, is Crash. It was written in the early 70s. Now, this is a book about people who get erotic satisfaction from car crashes and their victims. It's still a controversial and challenging subject. I want to ask you, what effect were you trying to induce with that book? I mean, what did you want us to see with that book that people hadn't seen or understood before?
I think I wanted to force people to face up to the fact that, that human beings find violence intensely exciting, that it touches the imagination in all kinds of ways, which may well be beneficial, horrific though it is to imagine that. I mean, there is no doubt that we are obsessed with violence, that we do find it enormously exciting. I wrote that book in 1972 at a time when, thanks to the liberation brought about by the 60s, our television and cinema screens were just saturated by images of violence of every kind. We'd had the Kennedy assassination, we had the Vietnam War, we had wars in gruesome civil wars in places like Biafra, Nigeria, with graphic material, newsreel material being shown on our TV screens every night, which you never see now. Public executions and tortures of various kinds. Now, cinema screens were full of violent car crashes. I didn't invent the car crash. I remember seeing images of the Kennedy assassination, of this comparatively young man with his wife beside him, having his head blown off as he rode in a motorcade through Dallas. I remember seeing this used as a backdrop to sort of rock programs on TV, and even once, I think, to a program about fashion. It may have been a magazine layout, but I thought, what is going on? People are, obviously unalienated from all this violence. They're embracing it. It's irrigating their imaginations in totally unexpected ways. What strange flower is going to bloom from this irrigation? And I thought, I've got to look at this. This is a subject worth exploring. And I thought, well, what I'll do is adopt the, Jonathan Swift's approach in A Modest Proposal. I'll take for granted from the very first word of the novel that car crashes are sexually fulfilling and life-enhancing. I'll take that nightmare logic, a psychotic logic, and see where it leads me. And I wrote it as a single parent bringing up 3 very young children who are crossing the road every day to wherever very young children go. And of course, nature could have played a horrifically bad joke on me. Fortunately, it didn't. But anyway, I clung to my sort of first objective. I wrote this novel which is a psychopathic hymn. There's no question about that. Utterly without any sort of moral redemption.